Last week, our brother Pumezo challenged us whether we as leaders are speaking out on the big issues of our day, whether we're confronting the evil in and around us. And this afternoon, I want us to ask, what can we as leaders learn here from King David? Those of you who have been studying biblical theology or have studied biblical theology with Nathan will be aware that what we find here in the books of Samuel is very much an emerging pattern of what God's king, God's Messiah, will look like when he comes. He will be someone who's chosen by God. He'll be someone who's anointed by a prophet. He'll be someone who goes out to confront his enemies. But we also learn that he's going to be someone who's going to be persecuted. He's going to be someone who comes to his kingship through suffering. And especially here in the second half of Samuel, we see this. We see this persecution. The author sort of weaves together the story of Saul, Israel's first king who failed to trust God, and David, the king after God's own heart. And where we are in the story now is that things have got so bad. Saul has been persecuting David out of envy, out of jealousy, to the extent that David has had to flee Israel and live in the land of the enemies, in the land of the Philistines. He's living in a little village called Ziklag, just outside the Philistine city of Gath. And there's been enormous tension in David's life because there's been a war between Israel and the Philistines. And the question is, who will David side with? Will he side with the Philistines and attack Saul, who's been pursuing him? Or will he turn on the Philistines and fight with Israel against these historic enemies? Achish, the Philistine leader who David's with, wants David to fight with him. But the other Philistine leaders don't quite trust David yet, and they send him and his men back to their city. Go home. And that's really where this story picks up. It's 3 days' march from the battlefield to Ziklag, and that's where we find ourselves in chapter 30. I have 3 points that I think we learn about God's king here. But the first point I want to make here is that God's king, because his ultimate trust is not in himself, God's king is able to bring peace under pressure. He can bring peace under pressure. I wonder if you've realized how pressure is often the true test of a leader. Maybe you've seen it in yourself, the kind of things that come out in your own life under pressure. Maybe you've seen it in the leaders around you. And David here is under incredible pressure. Try to just picture this for a moment. He's been under threat from Saul's army. He's been under threat from the Philistines who didn't trust him. Now, after 3 long days' march home, they just see that smoke rising from the city in the distance. Can you imagine what was going through their minds? We as readers know that their families hadn't been killed but taken off, but David and his men don't know that. Anything could have happened. Their families could be in shallow graves on the outskirts of the city, or more likely, they could all have been sold off as slaves. That wouldn't have been common in the ancient world. And the men are utterly devastated. We're told that David and his men wept aloud, verse 4, until they had no strength left to weep. But then it turns ugly, and some of the men begin to apportion blame. Who led us away from our homes? We should have been there to protect our families and our children. Who has taken us on this course? They start a David must fall campaign. How is David going to respond to this? Everyone is turning against him. Everything's been taken from him. Each one was bitter in spirit. How is David going to respond to this situation? Is he going to lash out? Is he going to try to take control of the situation? The men even want to stone him. Is he going to severely punish, maybe put to death, those who are opposing his leadership? That is exactly what Saul had done in some previous episodes. But David is very different. There's those wonderful buts in the Bible. You know, third year Romans class like we find in Romans 3, but now a righteousness from God. Verse 6, but David found strength in the Lord his God. He's emotionally distraught. He doesn't know what's going on, but because his trust is not finally in himself as a leader or in his own competency. He can pray, Lord, I'm confused, I'm perplexed. I don't know what's going on here, but I know that you are in control. I know that you're working out your purposes. And so he can actually bring a measure of peace, a measure of poise under this incredible pressure. You know, if your ultimate trust is in yourself, in your own competence, in your own preaching ability, when life really goes wrong, when there's a serious conflict in your church, when you lose your job, you'll be paralyzed, because if there's no power above you, what can you do? You'll be powerless to actually bring peace into that situation. So God's King brings peace because his ultimate trust is in the Lord. Secondly, I think here, God's King prayerfully pursues God's purposes. And again, I think here we need to see the contrast between David and Saul. When you look at Saul's life, you see that whenever a crisis hits, he's always coming up with his own solutions to the problems. There's no real prayer in his life. The Lord is absent from his reasoning. Others always have to tell him, Saul, shouldn't we pray in this situation? He's like, oh, yes, yeah, maybe we should pray. But David here is very different. Did you notice he doesn't even presume to know what the best course of action is? You can imagine the other men saying, what are we waiting for, David? We need to set off in pursuit of this raiding party. But did you notice, verse 8, that David is patient? He doesn't go in his own strength. He first inquires of the priest who's there with him. And he only goes with the Lord's blessing, verse 8. And did you notice that even when he goes with the Lord's blessing, he's immediately met with a setback? Because they haven't traveled far, when they reach a ravine, and 200 of the men say, we're simply too exhausted to continue. And so they leave those 200 there. You know, just because the Lord is blessing your work doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to have setbacks. Often you will. And here they have setbacks, but again, David finds strength, we're told, and he continues the pursuit with the 400 remaining. And as they continue, there's this very strange incident. I wonder if you thought about this. They come across this dying man in a field. And David and his men find him here. They nurse him back to life. He hadn't drunk for 3 days. And as he begins to drink and recover his strength, and he sort of opens his cracked lips, and he begins to reveal that he'd actually been part of this Amalekite raiding party, that he knows where these Amalekite raiders are hiding out, and that he can take them to them. And David strikes this bargain with him, and he promises to protect him. And I think we're meant to catch a little glimpse here again of the kind of king that David is, one who has compassion on the weak, one who protects the powerless. Very different, I think, to the Amalekites. It's a stark contrast. They seem to have a kind of ruthless survival of the fittest policy. As soon as the slave became sick, as soon as he became a liability, they didn't put him on one of those hundreds of camels that they'd stolen. They just left him out there in the desert to die. Maybe someone had a Make Amalek Great campaign again. Let's just leave the weak. They're a liability. But you know, the irony here is that what they thought was serving their own interests, just get rid of the weak, was actually turned out to be their downfall. Because it was actually this very weak slave who led David and his men right to them. God triumphs through weakness. And God's king here, as he's prayerfully dependent on God, is led ultimately to victory. Let's just apply this to ourselves for a moment. I wonder if you're like me. So often when a crisis hits, we become so anxious and we do everything in our own strength quickly to try to solve it. How often is prayer actually the last thing that we turn to? The old hymn, "Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer." God's king takes this crisis to God in prayer. And when he's convinced of the right course of action, he resolutely sets out, despite setbacks, to achieve it. But finally, I think we learn here about God's king that he will ultimately prevail over his enemies, that he will ultimately repossess all that is lost, and that he will share that victory with all of his people. The Egyptian leads David and his men here down to the raiding party. And again, I think you need to get a picture of the scene there in verse 16. There they were, scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, reveling because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and of Judah. You couldn't wish for a better scenario. They're half drunk, they're completely caught off guard. And David and his men have no problem striking them down, reclaiming everything that had been taken. I wonder if you notice that sort of universal emphasis here in the text. Verse 18, David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder, or anything else that had been taken. David brought everything back. God's king will prevail over his enemies. He will repossess all that has been lost. But now we come to actually what I think is really the heart of this story. And it's actually why this story, amongst many other military victories that David accomplished, why was this particular one recorded and remembered in Israel? Well, because as David and his men are coming back from their victory, they come back to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to actually continue. And as they do that, some of the men who'd been part of the battle, they begin to complain. And they say, look, these men didn't really help us win the battle. They can take their wives and go, but this plunder is actually ours because we were the ones who actually fought this battle against the Amalekites. And they have a point, don't they? They were the ones. What they're arguing for here is a kind of a strict meritocracy. They want a kind of perfect justice. Just give everyone what they've earned. Just give everyone what they deserve. That's all we're asking for. But did you notice how David actually sees things here very differently? Who has led and guided us to this victory? Who ensured that that one slave would fall ill and that we would find him before he died? Who ensured that he would know where this raiding party is? Who ensured the perfect timing that we would catch this raiding party completely off guard? No, it's the Lord. Everything is from the Lord. How does he say? Verse 23, no, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. Everything is from the Lord. The victory comes from his hand. Everything is a gift. And because that is true, everything is to be shared equally. Do you see David's grace here? Even the men are saying, this is David's plunder. But David takes that and he shares that equally amongst them all. Even with those, remember, who not too long ago had been talking of stoning him. This is the gracious king who shares his victory with all of his people. And in closing, I just want to reflect, I think like we always should, on how does this actually foreshadow the ultimate king? How does the king, David's kingship here, look forward to Jesus, the king in David's line? Jesus, we need to see, friends, also came ultimately to repossess the world for God. I have come to seek and to save what was lost, Jesus says, as his mission statement. He came to prevail against our ultimate enemies, not a particular group of evil people in the world, but the spiritual power of sin and death itself. I probably shouldn't allegorize, but I am going to allegorize here. Isn't it true that Satan has raided and plundered God's good world? Isn't it true that Satan has taken captive so many men and women? That Satan has literally burned cities to the ground? Isn't it true that Satan has destroyed relationships? When Jesus came proclaiming the kingdom of God is near, he was saying, I'm reclaiming the world for God. I've come to restore what has been lost. And the way Jesus did this was very surprising, through triumphing through weakness. On the day of the cross, it seemed like the ultimate triumph of evil. The religious leaders were wringing their hands for joy. The soldiers were celebrating their plunder, casting lots for Jesus' clothing. But they were completely unaware that on the cross, God was dealing with the ultimate enemy. He was paying the price for what our sin deserved. Rather than letting that fall on us, this is the king who shares his victory with us when we come to him, that victory over sin and death that we were singing about earlier. Do you see the gospel here in David's story? If you were in the story, who would you be? Do you think you'd be among those 400 men who continue the pursuit? Maybe you think that of yourself as someone who's done quite a lot of good in the world. Maybe your preaching can change the world, can set things right. Maybe even you have a little bit of this attitude of those 400 men. The real problem in the world is those people who want something for nothing. I've worked hard to get to where I am, to get my GWC degree, and now I deserve to be served. That was the attitude of the Pharisees in Jesus' day, but I think we need to ask ourselves, do we really want a strict meritocracy? Do you really want God to give you what you deserve for the way you've treated God and the way you've treated others? Or maybe do you see yourself more like the 200 here who are too exhausted to actually go out to the battle, who know that you fail? The gospel is actually that is all of us. We can't bring back what's lost. We can't fix the world for ourselves. We're powerless in the face of sin and death. And the very good news of the gospel is that where we've all failed, Jesus has gone out for us. He has won the victory for us, and he graciously shares that victory with us. And doesn't that empower you to actually go out on his mission to confront the evil that you find in the world? To the extent that we see that we actually deserve nothing good from God's hand, but that Jesus has shared his victory for us. And that'll make us generous people ourselves. Generous in your personal life, but also generous in your leadership of the church. You will make lead a church that wants to give towards Jesus' mission and not just keep all the resources to yourself. I think the message of this story, as we see it in the context of the whole Bible, is that if you know Jesus, the good news is that everything that has been lost, all those things that you've given up for him, you will ultimately get back as you continue to love him. As Paul says, all things will work out for your good. Isn't this a great king to follow, the generous king who shares his victory with us? Would that be true of us? Would that be reflected in our own leadership of the church? Amen.